October 25th, 1415, a muddy field between the forests of Agincourt and Agincourt in northern France. On one side, about 6,000 to 8,000 exhausted Englishmen, half of them archers, dressed worse than peasants. On the other, at least twice as many Frenchmen, an army packed to the brim with knights and the nobility of the entire country. On parchment, this day was supposed to be their easy stroll and triumph. By evening, however, thousands of aristocrats lay face down in liquid clay, their helmets clogged with mud and arrows, and the most prestigious military system in Europe was choking on its own steel and arrogance. By the end of the story, you will understand how a cheap bow and a piece of plowed field tore apart 500 years of knightly certainty. Imagine you are a French knight. Just last evening, everyone in the tents was joking and arguing about who would get the ransom for the English king. Henry V and servants were polishing armor to a shine. Squires were checking the horses. You can literally feel the weight of the steel on your body. It's not just protection. It's your social status, proof of your superiority over any foot soldier, any mud digger. But now, you're standing ankle-deep in sticky mud. Your horse is nervously eyeing the forest, and in front of you, in a narrow corridor, a ragged line of sharpened wooden stakes marks the position of the English archers. You came here for glory and money. Instead, you will get arrows, mud, and death from those you didn't even consider human yesterday. For the English, this isn't a chivalrous legend either. It's a brutal struggle for survival. Their army is marching through northern France after the grueling siege of Harfleur, where disease and hunger have already claimed hundreds of men. They are exhausted, soaked to the bone, and many are suffering from dysentery and fever. But Henry V is cornered. He needs to reach the safety of Calais, but between him and the coast stands the French army, a force that, on paper, is fully expected to crush his weary column. This is no place for the nightly game of capture and ransom. This is a grim, desperate calculation. Either they turn the French cavalry into fertilizer, or they will be left there themselves, rotting in the endless autumn rain. The context is simple, and yet absurd. The 100 Years' War is dragging on, a conflict as long as the hangover from someone else's ambitions. The English kings are still clinging to their ancient claims to the French throne and lands that once belonged to their dynasty. Henry V has just taken the throne and needs to prove he's not a boy, but a warrior king. Negotiations with the French are drowning in demands and mutual humiliation, and instead of making concessions, Henry chooses the old, reliable method: to land in Normandy, capture a port, march through enemy territory, and show that England still knows how to bite hard. France's response is predictable. It mobilizes everything it can: Constable Charles d'Albret, Marshal Boucicaut, the Dukes of Orléans, Alençon, and Burgundy, and dozens of other names that in the chronicles sound like a phone book of the feudal elite. Estimates of their strength vary, from 14,000 to 15,000 actual combatants to 20,000 to 25,000 when including armed servants, a clear numerical superiority over the English regardless. This is no people's militia, but a concentrated mass of titles, coats of arms, and ancestral ambitions. And almost every man standing here in the front ranks is certain. If anyone dies today, it will mostly be the English.
See how few they are. We shall simply ride over them. This will be an easy victory, gentlemen.
While he himself will, at worst, simply earn another heroic tale to tell at the banquet table. But behind the impressive facade, there's rot. The French army isn't a unified machine, but a gathering of barons, each wanting to be closer to the center of glory. There is a plan. Part of the cavalry is supposed to scatter the English archers, followed by a dense mass of men-at-arms to finish the job. However, ambition breaks the formation. The nobility demands to be at the front, the infantry and crossbowmen are pushed to the back, and the reserve turns into a chaotic tail. There are many orders, but only those that align with personal prestige are obeyed. In the end, the French army looks like a brilliant but terribly mismanaged machine, which they intend to steer by shouting, "Forward!" instead of using clear commands. On the English side, the main cheat code isn't armor or cavalry, it's the longbow. The longbow is a 2-meter stick of wood that a trained archer can draw hundreds of times a day. These archers had already rewritten the rules of war at Crécy and Poitiers, forcing the knights, the pride of Europe, to die before ever making contact. Their advantages are range, rate of fire, and simple math. One well-trained yeoman archer can loose 6 to 10 arrows a minute, any one of which can find a gap in armor, a horse, or an ill-positioned head. And most importantly, they cost the king far less than a single full set of knightly plate armor. The French are aware of these past successes, but they view them as an irritating anomaly from the previous century. In the last 100 years, armor technology has advanced. The plates have become thicker, the design more thoughtful, and the gaps narrower. In their eyes, the longbow is a peasant's weapon, unpleasant, but not fatal to a real warrior in full plate armor. Chronicles and modern research agree on one thing: their contempt for this lowly weapon and their faith in honor and the lance charge made the French elite blind to the fact that the combination of mud, a narrow front, and arrows could still turn their ranks into a slowly toppling wall of scrap metal. Henry V cannot afford such a luxury. He is not just a commander. He is the man personally responsible for the survival of his army and his kingdom. He chooses a position between two woods, Tramecourt and Agincourt, squeezing the front into a narrow corridor. This means the French numerical advantage simply can't be deployed across the full width of the field. The archers are positioned on the flanks, hammering sharpened stakes into the ground to deter cavalry from charging their sector. In the center is a relatively thin line of men-at-arms, many of whom are also dismounted. Henry is betting everything on a tight defense and controlling the space, not on a forward charge. The field itself is a separate character in this story. It had been recently plowed, and the autumn rains had mercilessly turned the earth into a quagmire, with the night before the battle only adding more moisture. The top layer had formed a crust, beneath which lay a viscous, clinging mud, ready to grip every step taken by a heavy, metal-clad man. Some reconstructions and sources state outright: the field at Agincourt was one of the primary killers of the knightly class. It constricted the space, eliminated the possibility of maneuver, and made every forward step feel like trying to wade out of a swamp while trapped in an iron barrel. The French plan looks formidable on paper. At the front is a vanguard of thousands of dismounted men-at-arms, followed by another line of heavy infantry. On the flanks are detachments meant to support and cover the main force. The particular pride is the elite cavalry. Its task is to break through to the archers and cut them down before the arrows can do their work. But when all of this is deployed in the real narrow corridor, it becomes clear: there is no room for maneuver. The men are standing 15 to 20 ranks deep, shoulder to shoulder, with new rows pressing from behind. The crossbowmen and archers, who were supposed to be used more actively, end up squeezed in the rear, simply because the nobility didn't want to give up their spots in the front lines. The night before the battle is a study in contrasts between two worlds. In the English camp, you can hear prayers and hushed voices. The chroniclers say Henry himself walked among the ranks, encouraging the men, promising that everyone who stood their ground would share in the glory, regardless of their birth. There is little wine or singing, mostly exhaustion, and the understanding that there is no way back. The French camp is entirely different. Feasts, excited talk, dividing up the anticipated spoils, debating who would be the first to capture Henry himself, and for what price they would later ransom him back. For one side, tomorrow is a matter of honor. For the other, it's a matter of a bonus. And that is a very different level of focus. In the morning, Henry V stalls for time, but he knows they can't wait forever. Their supplies are limited, and his men are exhausted. According to the chronicles, it is the English who take the first step. Literally. Their entire line moves forward as one, closing the distance to the French, to put their archers in effective range and force the enemy to react. The archers plant their sharpened stakes at an angle, creating a palisade that makes a cavalry charge tantamount to suicide. The French see this movement as a provocation, a gauntlet thrown down. To refuse the challenge would be to admit hesitation in the face of a far smaller enemy. Nearly the entire French high command chooses not their brains, but their code of honor. The first phase is the cavalry charge on the flanks. Several hundred horsemen surge forward across the sodden, plowed field, aiming for the archers. But the horses immediately sense the nightmare under their hooves. The ground gives way, their footing is lost. Every movement requires twice the effort. Then it gets worse. Sharpened stakes come into view, and arrows hiss down from above. The horses, even war-trained, have no desire to impale themselves on a forest of wooden spikes in a rain of iron. Their ranks break, some fall, and the French horsemen themselves become obstacles for one another. The cavalry that was meant to be the hammer turns into a pile of metal, stuck in the mud in front of the English flanks. This is where the true imbalance of the longbow becomes apparent. The arrows don't need to pierce the frontal plate of the finest cuirasses. It's enough for them to hit the horses, the less protected areas, the visor, the armpit, or the groin. The archer's rate of fire creates a veritable storm. Tens of thousands of arrows fall upon the compressed mass of men and animals in a short time. On dry ground, the cavalry might have built up speed and at least partially scattered the archers, but at Agincourt it gets bogged down and becomes a living shield for the advancing lines of French infantry. The longbow here is not a wonder weapon that magically pierces any armor, but a tool that, in alliance with the field and the density of the formation, systematically dismantles the French plan, piece by piece. The second phase begins as the main body of French men-at-arms enters the fight. They advance on foot, laboriously, step by step. Before them lie the bodies of men and horses, the ground churned up by hooves and boots. Every new step is a struggle against the clinging mud that pulls at their ankles and gaiters, forcing them to catch their breath more often than they'd like. From behind, their own men press forward, the reserve ranks, eager to get in on the glory. Those who stumble and fall often don't get back up. In the morass, under the pressure of dozens of bodies, a man in full armor turns into a heavy iron capsule, impossible to escape from without help. The chronicles describe men who died not by the sword, but from suffocation and the crushing weight of their comrades. When the French front line finally reaches the English centre, it is no longer an orderly wall of shields, but a gasping, disorganized mass of metal. The close-quarters combat begins, where the English men-at-arms, also dismounted, fight under conditions that level the playing field. They are fewer in number, but they are not packed as tightly, and can at least move more freely. At this moment, the archers do what is often forgotten in romanticized legends. They drop their bows and advance with axes, swords, and daggers. Lightly equipped, in leather armor or just padded jacks, they move through the mud more swiftly, clamber over fallen knights, and drive their daggers into the visors of helmets. This is no longer a battle of nobles, but a slaughterhouse where there is no time to pay heed to the coats of arms on an opponent's chest. At this stage, the psychology breaks. The French second line sees not an orderly battle ahead, but a seething mass of bodies that is impossible to approach properly. Any attempt to move forward ends with men getting stuck, losing their balance, and becoming targets for more arrows and blows. Individual knights attempt heroic sorties, but in the cramped chaos, these change little. When the Duke of Alençon falls, when the Constable of France and other pillars of the aristocracy are left in the mud, everything turns into one massive shock. The system, built for centuries on the idea that the heavy knight is the pinnacle of the food chain, is now dying en masse at the hands of those who, by the established rules, shouldn't even be considered worthy opponents. The third phase is chaos and brutal decisions. According to some sources, at the height of his victory, Henry receives word that a French force has outflanked him and attacked the English camp, where the wounded and prisoners were held. Fearing a fresh attack on his exhausted army from the rear, the king gives an order that will be debated for centuries: to execute most of the captured knights. For the medieval mindset, which operated on captivity and ransom, this move was akin to sacrilege against the unwritten rules of honor. But for Henry, it was pragmatism. He could not risk hundreds of heavily armed enemies, if freed, stabbing him in the back. In the eyes of contemporaries, this no longer looked like a battle, but like a massacre. When it was all over, the field of Agincourt was not a romantic picture, but a dump of human bodies and iron. The estimates of casualties vary, but the scale is clear. Thousands of French were killed, a significant portion of them from the nobility, including 3 dukes, numerous counts, a viscount, an archbishop, and hundreds of knights and squires. English losses were disproportionately smaller, anywhere from 100 to several hundred men, according to different sources. To the people of that time, this seemed like a miracle, almost a divine intervention. Modern historians put it more simply: a combination of flawed tactics, poor command, and lethal terrain. The ravens and dogs don't argue with either side. For them, it was simply a feast for many days. The blow to the French elite was colossal. Imagine a system where governing regions, collecting taxes and military mobilization all depended on specific families with specific coats of arms. Then, in a single day, dozens of these families were either wiped out in the male line or found themselves in English captivity, turned into bargaining chips and tools for political pressure. Lines of succession were thrown into confusion, lands shifted to other branches, and widows and guardians began fighting over the pieces. The English nobility also paid its price. The Duke of York, for instance, fell on the field. But the scale is incomparable. France lost a part of the brain and the spine of its feudal pyramid. On a political level, Agincourt opened the doors Henry had dreamed of. In the following years, he methodically exploited the shock and weakness of France, launching new campaigns, capturing cities, and pressuring the divided French elite. A few years later, this culminated in the Treaty of Troyes, which recognized Henry as the heir to the French throne and regent. England achieved what, at the time of their landing in 1415, had seemed like an insane objective. From a military standpoint, the battle became a symbol of a period of English dominance, which would last until the emergence of a new French energy with the rise of Joan of Arc at Orléans in 1429. But the most significant takeaway is the military lesson. Agincourt demonstrated that a well-organized force of infantry and archers positioned on favorable terrain and under unified command could defeat even an elite heavy cavalry and knightly infantry. The longbow here was not a magic wand, but part of a system. Discipline, the choice of position, the use of the landscape, and a king willing to fight alongside his men, not hide behind his barons. For Europe, this was another, but very loud, signal. The era where the outcome of war was decided by the charges of individual, heroic knights was coming to an end. Ahead lay the century of infantry, mass armies, missile troops, and, a little later, cannons. It's no surprise that Agincourt quickly became shrouded in myth. For the English, it was transformed into the Feast of St. Crispin, a day when a happy few defeated the army of a great power. Later, Shakespeare would gift Henry V a rousing speech that he most likely never gave in reality, but which fit perfectly into the national myth. For the French, it long remained a trauma, an example of how pride and disunity can destroy even the bravest elite. Modern historians debate the exact numbers, the true impact of the longbows, and the battle's precise location. But on one point, there is no doubt. This is not a legend, but a real, documented collapse of a system that believed honor and steel were always stronger than mud and wood. If we pull the camera back even further, Agincourt appears as a lesson that humanity loves to forget. The French nobility arrived here confident that the old rules still applied, that expensive armor was more important than discipline, that titles outweighed tactics, that numbers mattered more than terrain. The English army, exhausted, hungry, and half made of peasants, demonstrated the opposite. In the right hands, a cheap tool, multiplied by intelligence and cold calculation, can shatter ancient power structures. What died that day at Agincourt was not chivalry as personal courage. It was the illusion that courage alone can replace mathematics, physics, and common sense. And every time some elite decides that its status alone is armor against reality, a muddy field like Agincourt somewhere in the future already awaits its steps.